Productive Pastor 127. Is there a relationship between ministry productivity and church health? With the front matter, I want to get into the meat of this episode because it's something I'm passionate about and something that I have been thinking about so much over the last few weeks. So before we go into that rabbit hole, I want to bring up the mission of Productive Pastor, healthy ministry through strategic productivity. And hopefully in that phrase, I've created enough boundaries around it to actually have a real conversation. I know enough about the folks who listen and engage to this podcast that these are the folks who are actually interested in a conversation around ministry and productivity. And so I asked myself this question: is there a relationship between productive ministry and church health? And honestly, that's a real question. Some people might say yes, and others might argue that any sort of productivity in ministry is a result of a spiritual affront to the Holy Spirit. And trust me, in there's certain circles, that could be quite the interesting discussion. And I ask that because of the dual nature of my own vocation now. I'm helping pastors in churches that are struggling. And if you do the same thing over and over again, you'll start to see some of the same things pop up. And that's what I do full-time as the Congregational Vitality Strategist in the Louisiana Conference United Methodist Church. But also with the whole relationship between productivity and church health, there's a weird zone of manipulation that can happen in it. And this needs to be recognized, needs to be understood, and it's also deeply personal for me. So it's all that. I think we have to talk about what our goals are. This will really help us define ministry health and a lot of different aspects, both personal but also in our churches, because both of them need to be healthy. I say all the time at work, healthy pastors create healthy churches, and healthy churches create healthy pastors. Gaining something is always a good thing, but losing health in the process just makes us head backwards. And at first, we might think like that's a worthy sacrifice, but it's a debt which always has to get paid. And that's where the manipulation side comes into play. More for the sake of more, especially in church health, but that's not actually healthy. It leads to an exhausted pastor, not a healthy pastor, and a frantic church, which is also not a healthy church. So enter strategic productivity, the second part of the mission. And I've been trying to find ways to explore and understand this better this last year. And a few months back, I stumbled into the work of German sociologist Hartmut Rosa. And he has a couple of primary theories which I want to bring up. And I'm not an expert. I've gone 2 steps past Wikipedia, so don't call me an expert. But he has these 3 theories that I feel like are in relation to this conversation. The first one is one of abstract time. Time is no longer natural and linear in our world, but instead it's governed by tasks. Absent time makes us live a life that has to be constantly moving, innovating, and optimizing. And it's measured not on time, but how many things you can get done. I think a lot of the work of somebody like Cal Newport speaks into this reality really well. The second theory that Rosa has is called social acceleration. With every single thing is faster now, and it changes our expectations about things, but it also alienates us from life. The last theory of Rosa I've been learning about is called dynamic stabilization. Because of social acceleration, we have to speed up more just to stay where we are right now. And my own thoughts about productivity, it really began to change significantly in 2019. If you've been part of Productive Pastor for the last decade, you probably have caught that shift. And that was one of the reasons I shut down the first version of this podcast in 2019. COVID-19 also took what was a very personal experience for me of asking these tough questions and dealing with burnout and those sorts of things. And it made it a global reality for everyone in ministry. COVID instantly accelerated what was expected of ministry. And I'll give you a quick case study from my own life, a story about live stream worship. Now in 2020, my growing church plant, and it was a very modern church, we had never live streamed. And I had reasons I thought it wasn't an appropriate use of resources or really a part of our strategy, but in those 12 months from March 2020 to March 2021, the church I led only met in person for 7 or so months. We had a pretty long round of virtual only worship in March of 2020. And then we went back into it in December of 2020 till around February of 2021 because of COVID-19. We also opened up a brand new building literally the Sunday before we shut things down again. So it got very personal. But let me ask you this. How many churches do you know that didn't live stream before COVID-19? and now continue to stream, especially smaller, resource-cautious churches. Now, I'm not going to go off in this episode about why I'm not a fan of live streaming currently, but I think of how many expectations and stressors and resources are now expected of any church that operates really at any level or any size. This is dynamic stabilization at work. And it also plays into this idea of manipulation because we have to fight the desire of being big in our ministry. And we also, to come back to that live stream example, have what was only once an expectation of the largest churches, and it's now expected of any church. Like, you cannot not have live streaming. I look at folks I know who made the decision to stop doing that, and I'm envious of them, and I also love the strategy that they've laid out behind that. But during COVID, our fast approach to live streaming, as well as doing a lot of video content during that first wave in the spring of 2020, it worked really, really well. In between staff members, in between me, in between worship services, we probably were doing 5 to 10 different video forward streams a week. And we had really solid quality on it. I mean, I had a background in video, a background in tech. It was easy for us to kind of ramp stuff up quick because we weren't doing Sunday morning, and we also weren't doing so many of our other ministries. And we rebuilt systems around it. And we gained actually a really solid reputation around our community for that sort of ministry. And then COVID started to open things back up, and the normal expectations of ministry crept back in, and then also just the wide amount of change that any church had to do in the summer of 2020, that popped up. And we've been in this video content ramp up for 3 or 4 months. We want to keep the consistency up while also making it easier to keep the quality level up. So we went from around probably a $2,000 top investment, used a lot of equipment that was older that I had laying around, to a $15,000 investment in live streaming. $15,000. Church plant. Less than 200 people. And you want to hear the lunacy of it all? We didn't even have internet in the building that we were meeting in. So we had to get a fancy hotspot that was designed for virtual workers that were doing van life. Like, that's how we found out about this hotspot, on YouTube, searching van life and seeing how they were getting internet. So this case study, simply, it was us trying to keep up with what I now understand as Rosa's theories of dynamic stabilization and social acceleration. And I've spent the last 4 years decompressing away from what I call the hustle bus approach to ministry productivity into a more mindful approach to productivity. And the last year, I feel like I actually began to see the tough work and the fruit of that work in a major way. And not just like a flat line, but also understanding the patience of working the long, slow curve and beginning to see compounding results. As I transitioned into this job 1.5 years ago, I had to level up so many of my vocational competencies in ministry, and I did the slow, deliberate work, and it's paid off. So there's a way to get around Rosa's theories that he has about what kind of runs our world. The next part of the story is reactive versus proactive. And if you've been on the podcast for any length, you've heard me talk about this. But almost always it's inside of the paradigm of individual pastoral leadership. Now, that matters. Reactive versus proactive matters tremendously in our personal ministry approach to things. But to lead organizations into proactivity, we have to have our own stuff figured out first. We have to embody this sense of proactive ministry in the way that we're ordering our own life. You know, you cannot be reactive as a pastor and try to get the church to be proactive. It doesn't work that way. I've been reading several books about this lately, and I'm beginning to understand it, so much more. One of those books, and this is a small short series from Todd Bolsinger, is this book. I started it just today, and I'm halfway through it. They're little books, but it's called Invest in Transformation, Quit Relying on Trust. It's a huge book, and it definitely talks so much about the character of somebody who's having to lead inside of transformation. I'm also reading another really good book right now. It's called The Innovation Delusion. And in chapter 9, the authors of this book tell the story of proactivity. Now, first, this isn't a book about ministry. It's about the competing vision of innovation versus maintenance inside of business and physical systems and engineering and civic infrastructure, all that sort of thing. But I've got notes all throughout that book, and I'm finding all sorts of ministry parallels all over the place. Now, as I said earlier, my day gig now is at annual conference level, not a Methodist church. I serve the entire state. My title is this congregational vitality strategist, and I have 260 churches I serve. Post-COVID and all the other disruptions of the last 5 years in church life, plus our denomination went through a split, and we also have this interesting window to understand how churches can thrive. Now in Louisiana, 90% of our conference is made up of churches that are under 125 in average worship. So it's this whole pack of normal-sized churches. And I focus all of my time now on understanding and helping create stability in these churches. And this book, The Innovation Delusion, has had me thinking. But I go back to the reactive and the proactive. The story in the book is about the director of the Baltimore Water Department and how they had to build in the necessary strategy to slowly gain money over time to replace and to maintain this giant but very well-built water system. And this is part of the question about the relationship between healthy ministry through strategic productivity and church health. We have to be understanding that a proactive approach to ministry is necessary church-wide in order to find and maintain church health. Now, yes, we have to think about our buildings, but we have to think about growth. And not for growth's sake, but to simply keep ministry not just existing, but thriving. We can't leave discipleship, care of one another, spiritual formation, and evangelism on just the side of the road and just keep plugging away at the weekly existence of meetings and running a staff and sermon preparation. A proactive approach knows time and resources need to be built in order to maintain the church and her health. So back to those big questions I had at the beginning. I don't think that there is an affront to the Holy Spirit when we talk about ministry productivity, especially greater ministry health through strategic productivity. And for me, this all boils down to the issue of faithfulness. One of the passages in Scripture that absolutely haunts me is found a few times in the Gospels, but Luke 12:48 is one example. From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded, and from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. As pastors, we are spiritually entrusted with our congregations and our spheres of influence, and that's a pretty weighty task, and I 100% believe there are spiritual dimensions to this. We have to realize that we have unique calls, not just as pastors, but the churches we serve, and pieces of ministry that are given to us, and we should want to be found faithful as we pursue these things. I feel that some pastors struggle with understanding growth or evangelism because they don't have a theological framework for it. And I would suggest that rather than saying these things are bad, that we instead need to dig deep into developing that framework for reaching new people and for discipleship. The second, big question I've kind of asked at the beginning of this episode is this. I see and I hear many of the same things over and over. And it's rarely a lack of passion, both in a pastor or a church, but it's often a space, it's an adaptive challenge where new skills need to be learned and leadership developed to lead congregations through a season of instability, and not just towards stability, but into full vitality. Be honest with yourself. I've talked a lot about how we as pastors need to understand the growth of vocational capacity. We can learn to build up those places where we're lacking and learn to further hone those we're strong in. This is not about us becoming great at what we're bad at, but us becoming stable at what we're not best at and really understand what we're great at, both as pastors and as churches. I go back to this book, The Innovation Delusion, and their thoughts about maintenance. I rarely talk with pastors who are innovating well and wondering why their church might not be growing. But what I find out often is that the pastors who don't understand that some of the more modern maintenance strategies of church, and I'm not talking about physical buildings, they don't realize how powerful it can be to develop systems and strategies to take care of the things which really matter. Strategic generosity through discipleship, the power of communication in modern ministry, how to develop leaders and how to keep ministries healthy, and how valuable it is to keep accurate data across the church to understand the congregation's actual engagement. That's a really big thing. What I also see is when pastors and churches begin to start working on that unseen part of ministry, which falls into this category of maintenance, they start to see stabilizing growth. And the last part of this is the exhausted pastor syndrome. And I've had to learn myself several times that you're going to hit a point in ministry where working harder no longer works. It is absolutely confounding when you find yourself at this place. This exhaustion, or on the other side of the coin, this high you get from seeing results happen, that's where the manipulation piece comes in. That's the danger zone you find yourself in. It's one of the reasons I love Clifton Strengths. It helps anybody diagnose where and when they start to do those things, and then it gives practical handholds in order to get out of it. So to kind of wrap things up, I'm not sure to what level I've convinced you that church health and growth and ministry productivity are related. I think they are. But I really want to do this episode to just kind of pop a flare to this conversation and to signal a shift in productive pastor, at least for the next year. And so if you're curious about this, a couple things, make sure you hit the show notes for links to keep up with more of the congregational health and development stuff I do. revchadbrooks.com/PPP/127. And I'm also super stoked to start recording these new episodes in the coming weeks. I won't be releasing them weekly, but you're going to still see me around. You can hang out in the Productive Pastor community on Facebook to find out more, get the emails to where we kind of dig into the stuff we've always done. But I got a strong deck of stories with other pastors leading normal-sized churches that I cannot wait to share. And we're going to cover the gamut. We're going to talk about what does it mean to lead ministry through natural disaster. What does it mean when you're dealing with chronic health issues as a pastor and you're leading a growing church? What does it mean to actually be innovative? What does it mean to find and discover those things? What does it mean to find ministry passion on the outer edges and to still keep the fervor that you have growing? That's just the first quick burst we have of these episodes that are planned. So I'm Chad Brooks. Thanks for listening to Productive Pastor, and I will see you back on the next episode.